Today's video isn't on this Springfield SAR-8.
This Springfield SAR-8. Hi, Misha here, and this came in, and there's definitely a story here. The whole confusion. Technically, there are three different guns marked SAR-8. You had the original SAR-3s overstamped SAR-8, like mine you've seen. Then you had the true factory SAR-8s built in Greece. And then finally, you have these things. The parts are Greek, although I think some German might have been used too, brought over, including the barrel, which is nice. You get the original barrel. But put together here by Springfield on a U.S. receiver from Federal. And the fun doesn't stop there. It's a tad boxy, you might think. That's because this is not a stamped steel receiver. This is a machined alloy receiver. Yeah. And it has a rail on top. That would be good, maybe, if it were actually 1913 Picatinny. It is not. Interesting story. I thought this would be worth doing a video on because of all the confusion of the different SAR-8s. And also revisiting a dark time in our history known as the Federal Assault Weapons Ban, which is part of the crime bill passed by Congress in '94 and signed into law by then President Clinton, and it lasted until September of 2004. That is why this gun has a fixed muzzle brake, no bayonet lug, but it was allowed to take standard G3 HK91 mags. And it could even have a pistol grip, but not a collapsing or folding stock. So let's go back to the table, compare and contrast this with the other ones, talk about the assault weapons ban. For you youngins who missed it, congratulations, you were lucky. See, it's not always bad being younger and all, because it was not a fun time if you like these kinds of guns. But first, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support us, check out the link to Patreon. With that, let's dive in.
The situation's even more confusing. This is an SAR-8. And this is marked SAR-8, well, overstamped. It's effectively, and originally was made as an SAR-3. Now, we covered this in quite some detail in a video last year, but just to kind of go over the whole Springfield and Ebo, Greece situation as quick as I can. Back in 1985, the two companies started working to import an HK91 clone into the USA, which is fine because Greece was already making the G3 for their use. And by 1987-88, things were up and running, and serials began at 05001, so 5001. And the first guns were actually named not SAR-8 or 3, but actually G3. And the first change would come around the serial number 5200 when they would add made in Greece to the receiver. The first 200 or so guns had Ebo Greece on the barrel, but not on the receiver. And since the receiver is the firearm, ATF doing ATF things. The next step, though, would come thanks to HK definitely doing HK things. Before serial 5499, the name had to be changed. Sometime around 547D, 5480, in that range. The last G3s we see are, 5,470 some odd, and then by 5,480 something, we start to see the SAR-3 marking. So just under 500 G3 Springfield Greek imports came in, and of those, the first 200 did not actually have made in Greece on the receiver. I thought I would just point this out in case you run across these, even if they're uncommon. These are all, strictly speaking, pre-ban guns, meaning they were imported and out of the warehouses before March of 1989, when then President George Bush signed an executive order which became an import ban. So yeah, G3 early on, and then you get to the SAR-3s. Those are the pre-bans. So before we move on to an interesting phase, how many HK91 clones did Springfield successfully import from Greece before the ban hammer came down in '89? Well, the last known SAR-3 serial is 5,807. So let's say 5,810, just to have a round number, meaning that all told, just over 800 came in, assuming every serial made it. No defects, no rejections, no oopsies. What's a little funny is that everyone would want the G3, of course, but more G3s technically came in, about 500, than SAR-3s, technically just over 300. Minor point, I just thought I would, point that point out. But after March of '89, things get more interesting with the overstamp guns in the true transitional period. During this period, guns were in customs and transit and bonded warehouses awaiting to be sold, and they were marked SAR-3. Well, in May of '89, these were released, but they had to be modified to some extent. The SAR-3 was overstamped with an 8, 3 to 8, and a thumbhole stock was hastily attached. I believe Bishop made them initially. But it's funny enough, the original grip and stock were included as a quote-unquote accurizing kit. And otherwise, things are pretty well left alone. The barrel still has a removable muzzle device, although these would be taken off, usually when they were sold, but of course they could easily be put back on. And these never did have bayonet lugs. Even the HK91s didn't originally in the pre-ban, but you can easily add one if you want. So basically, they had to be sold this way because of importation, but you could put them to rights. And this was approved through November of 1990. So for the next year and a half, you could do that, sell them that way, because that's when the ban would go fully into effect, and things would change forever. So this era, basically 922R doesn't really apply. They're trying to figure out things, transitional period, and these guns were Cotton Customs transitionals. And we've looked at Kalashnikovs that had the same thing happen to them, and of course some HK91s had the same thing happen to them, and they had a 1 added, so they're HK911s, which is kind of funny. It's a really interesting deal. So how many of these custom guns were there? Well, the serials picked right up after the pre-ban SAR-3s, around 5, 8, 30, I think is around the kind of first known one, but we can assume, because again, they were just going on progression, and they range all the way up to 8,984, give or take. So quite a large chunk, which kind of leads to the idea, if they were able to get that many in customs at the time, that it took a while to maybe get this project rolling with Greece, but once they did, they were sending thousands a year over. But that was just that one batch. Assuming we can trust the serial numbers, that means a little over 3,000 came in, 3,100. So 800 pre-ban, 3,000-ish Cotton Customs, which are effectively the same gun as a pre-ban, frankly. But what happens after November of 1990? Now we move into the true SAR-8s. So, the real SAR-8 will actually be factory stamped SAR-8, and it will come with a thumbhole stock. They actually did change thumbhole stock subcontractors at one point, but I don't know exactly when. These were still Greek-made guns, You could replace the thumb hole with standard furniture, although, you're kind of out of that limited warranty period that they took standard magazines. The really big difference comes at the barrel. Like I said, the transitional guns had a standard threaded barrel with tines with this and a removable device. What they did here, they essentially cut that off and pressed on a fake flash hider, so it actually looks about here like a carbine barrel instead of a nearly 18-inch barrel with flash hider. The flash hider comes further back and doesn't work as a flash hider because that was something the band would not allow. So you can tell the true SAR-8's not only by the stamping and the serial, but also the barrel looks a little different. And that's a bit of a shame because you can't fully restore the barrel because it is modified permanently by chopping off part of the end. And you can pull off the pressed on flash hider, but still leaves you with some issues. And these would come in through the 1990s. How long? I don't know. Some sources say they ended in 94, others say 98. We do have a pretty good idea of the serials, though. They actually picked up right before 9,000, around 8,996 is one of the earliest registered SAR-8 serials, so they kept on there. And they rolled all the way up to nearly 13,000. So they brought over a pretty significant number, about 4,000 true SAR-8s. Imports, but with a fully neutered barrel. Not bad for what they were. So those are probably the ones people want. G3, SAR-3, SAR-3/8, or even the SAR-8, perfectly good gun. But then we get today's subject matter, this guy. And they kept the same name, SAR-8, and sowed confusion for decades. They even continued the same serial range. This one's in the 14,000s, for example, but yeah, picking up off the SAR-8s. As far as I know, these were introduced around 1998, because at the end of 97, or April of 1998, President Clinton signed an addition to the 89 ban, which now made standard magwells a naughty feature for imports. It also banned several guns by name. So this effectively put the end to lots of imports, including the SAR-8 and several FALs besides. Springfield's response was to use original military parts and build them here. I don't know for how long, but it was during the assault weapons ban, because they all have these muzzle brakes on it. Because by that time, beginning in September 94, yes, the national ban was in effect. So by this point in the 90s, we not only have an import ban, but we have a national ban. One of those is gone today. One is not. So let's look at the features as such on this gun.
So back here, the controls and manipulation are pretty standard. Check out this magwell. I think they just tried to make size count for strength. And they actually pinned, there's two pins, one on top, one on bottom, running this way, the original machined trunnion into this receiver. So it is the original trunnion. So technically, your trunnion and bolt carrier are all original military type parts locking together. And this could work. I mean, after all, the AR-15 uses a similar setup. But you are putting a lot of load on these pins. These have not been deformed. Some people have reported stretching and bending of the pins at high round counts. Then again, it is the internet. But it is definitely fugly, regardless. The charging handle is actually smooth. A lot of the U.S. assembled guns, especially the ones from Century, G3s or 70s, are really gritty and stiff, especially when new. Even nice guns like Vectors were stiff when new. This one's pretty smooth. I gotta give it credit. The lower is SEF marked, but blocked to just safe and semi. That's neat though. It's a steel lower. They clipped off the front where the pin would be. No push pin. Back in the day, everyone was kind of copying the HK91 style, which didn't have a paddle or a push pin, and that's what continued on until many years later. And of course, it has a standard buttstock, 2 pins in the back. Imports needed a thumbhole stock because of the 89 restrictions, but the 94 assault weapons ban was actually slightly less restrictive. The 89 ban pretty much only allowed for taking standard capacity mags, standard mag well. The 94, because it allowed essentially one evil feature plus that, gave you pistol grip. But if you wanted to have anything else, you had to give up that. That's why some of the M1As from Springfield made during the ban actually do have a flash hider, but no bayonet lug because they don't have a pistol grip stock. So, kind of funny, different times, what have you. Just wanted to kind of get in front of the camera and show you this beautiful, you know what this reminds me of? An early polygonal model from like GoldenEye. Chunky.
For what it's worth, this gun still has its original Springfield box. Nothing fancy, it's cardboard. But these guns weren't meant to be fancy. From the beginning to the end, they were meant to be an economical alternative to the ever-increasing pricey German HK imports. They did the same thing with some FALs, the MBELs, even some Galils Springfield imported towards the end. And of course, they did the famous BM59s. So, yeah, the box for what it is. And nothing fancy inside, just plastic. These came with standard magazines because the mags were pre-94. Almost always the alloy mags as far as I can remember. That's about it. I guess one benefit you could say over the SAR-8, for this SAR-8, you know, the import versus this one, is these did come with a pistol grip and standard stock, whereas the imports had to have the thumb hole, and neither one had a working flash hider, but at least this does have a working muzzle brake, which isn't bad to have on a 308. But of course, the downside, you got this receiver. Oh boy, this receiver. It's a thing. It's a thing. So what do you think? Let's wrap this up.
So, ending here. Do these have value today? At the very least, the original parts do. The barrel, the internals. Again, the receiver is questionable, but it's not something that you hear of exploding in your face immediately. Before it fails, you're going to notice signs around here. And it doesn't seem like they're failing in huge numbers over the last 20, 30 years. But still, yeah, I think it's very cosmetically unattractive, and you have a weird rail you can't use. So at the very least, this is worth it as a parts kit, or just a beat-around shooter gun. It's certainly the most inferior of the Springfield G3 HK91 types, but I would still, ugly receiver or not, rank it above a lot of the Century offerings, because as funky as this Federal receiver is, a lot of the Century offerings were on Hess receivers, and Century was known for grinding bolts and rollers to fit, and that's not how you do it. I'm not saying Springfield didn't do that too, but I haven't heard of it. I will just say that Springfield seems a lot more professional, especially back in the 90s compared to Century. But yeah, this came in. By the way, the trigger's fine. It's normal trigger. And I thought it was an interesting piece of history and kind of an excuse to reminisce and be really grateful we're not in the assault weapons ban era. I did actually own one of these myself eons ago, around 2000, 2002 time frame. I bought it cheap because someone had rattle can painted it FDE, and no, it wasn't Fox, unless he was doing that when he was like 5. But I got it cheap for that. I shot it a lot, and I will say it ran fine, and I never noticed any receiver wear, but, you know, your mileage definitely will vary. But yeah, if you own one of these, feel free to let us know in the comments. But I wanted to at least do this video because I ended up with this because the person who bought it confused SAR-8s and brought it to me, asked if I wanted it. Why not? It's a 308 7.62 Nano shooter. It's fine. But buyer beware. And it's pretty easy to tell them apart, even to me as a blind guy. I mean, braille and chunky receiver. But that's what you're looking at. Appreciate you hanging out. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. We've got plenty of other videos on the G3 and Set Me on this channel as well. And if you'd like to help support us, there's always Patreon, $1 and up a month. This is Misha, and we'll catch you very soon next time.